Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to you. We understand that we are all a bit tired, and some of us decided to continue the political discussion in the club manner somewhere else, in the Irish pub, I believe. But I would like to continue our good tradition. That is, each Valdai club presents books they were written, inspired, or sponsored by the Valdai club. Or even if not sponsored, or even if not inspired, that at least written by the members of this club, which makes this event very warm and pleasant, because it's usually wonderful to introduce books of your friends and colleagues. It's beautiful to have the opportunity to say that this year we have 4 books printed by our colleagues. But on top of everything, there is another important message here. Valdai Club is shifting slowly, step by step, towards being a think tank. I cannot imagine a serious think tank without serious research. I cannot imagine the think tank without working papers, without books that are presented to the public, not because we are attached to the written word, but because these books contain very valuable ideas. And these ideas are then transformed into presentations, conversations, advice, whatever. Because all of us are working as a consultants for our different governments and different ministries of external affairs and so on and so forth. So all these books are not just what we have to do in order to keep our tenure, but rather the collection of very good ideas. And that's why I would like to start today with book that got recently a prize, the Douglas Dillon Prize for the best book on U.S. diplomacy, awarded by the American Academy of Diplomacy. And this book is written by Dr. Angela Stent from the Center for Eurasia, Russia, and Eastern European Studies in Georgetown University. It's a great pleasure, Angela. And also, can you show me your book for a moment? Because I read this book, and I remember that in the pre-last sentence of your introduction, if I will find the introduction, you are grateful to the Valdai Club, yes? Yes, absolutely. My understanding of the views of the Russian leadership has been enhanced by the participation in the Valdai International Discussion Club for the last decade. Direct link to Valdai. Angela.
Thank you very much, Piotr. It's an honor and a pleasure to present the book. I have, a half-hour presentation, an hour presentation, but I think I have 10 minutes, right? So
please, Angela.
I'll try and do it quickly. So, and I should say my book is coming out in Russian in a couple of months. So, I wrote this book asking the question, why has it been so difficult for the United States and Russia to develop a productive partnership over the last 22 years, since the end of the Cold War and since the end of the ideological divide between the two countries. And I know that in every Russian discussion like this, there are 2 key questions: Kto vinovat, who's guilty, and then there's the что делать, what can we do about it? And both of those questions have very complicated answers here. The very short answer to the question about why it's been so difficult to develop a productive U.S.-Russian relationship, and by the way, I go into 4 resets in my book, which hopefully I'll have time to mention briefly in this presentation, is, to put it quite simply, that we have a very different idea of what a productive relationship would look like. And we've already heard this today, of course, in all of the discussions. From the U.S. point of view, and certainly going back to the 1990s, the idea was that a post-communist, post-Soviet Russia would accept, if you like, the rules of the liberal international order, the Euro-Atlantic values that we and our allies believed were universal. And of course, we know what's happened to that, and we've heard it discussed today. I think the Russian idea was very much that a productive partnership with the United States would mean that the United States would accept that Russia had a right to a sphere of privileged interests in its neighborhood. And that, of course, has been a major problem between the two countries since the fall of the Soviet Union. And then again, we heard about that today. There have been several persistent issues in the US-Russian relationship over the last 22 years, and I just want to flag a few of them. First of all, there is, and that's been good at times, but it's basically a problem, the disproportionate importance of personalities in this relationship. Again, simply put, the United States and Russia have never had, and even the Soviet Union, a very close economic relationship because, unlike Europe and Russia, we aren't really economically very compatible. That is to say, Russia's major exports, energy, military hardware, things like that, are not things that the United States needs, and therefore it has inherently limited the economic relationship. Therefore, we have a very small group of stakeholders in the United States in this relationship, and I think the same is true in many ways for Russia. Also, if you like, our relationship is structurally an anomaly in as much as we're the world's two nuclear superpowers, and our relationship therefore has focused very much on the nuclear aspect, which is very important, but that also involves a rather small number of stakeholders. So because of that, and because of institutional asymmetries, the role of the two presidents has been disproportionately important in this relationship. Now, when it's worked, and I would say it worked rather well, in the first Clinton presidency, at least from the US point of view, and probably to some extent from those who worked with President Yeltsin, although you may disagree with it. That was one time when it worked well in those first maybe 4 years, 92 to 96. I would argue it worked well in the first, let's say, 3 years, more or less, of the George W. Bush administration, when the relationship between President Bush and President Putin really was quite close and then fell apart for reasons that we can go into. And it certainly worked well in the first Obama administration with the personal relationship between President Obama and President Medvedev. And that often has driven the relationship. And of course, when those relations aren't good, then the relationship has suffered more than maybe a relationship between the two nations where there were more stakeholders. Another persistent problem has been, and again you heard this today, a very different evaluation of the 1990s. Most Americans, not all of them, but many of them, believed that the 1990s was a time of greater pluralism, of a Russia that was moving away from a Soviet system towards greater democracy. And as you all know, this is not how it's viewed in Russia, and we heard it again very strongly from Mr. Volodin. The 1990s is viewed as a time of chaos, as humiliation for Russia, as a time of weakness, and it's directly connected, therefore, to U.S. policy. So that has been a persistent problem. A third persistent problem has been, and again, we've already discussed it today, the failure of the West, and here I would say the United States, Canada obviously, and Europe, to create a Euro-Atlantic security architecture in the 1990s in which Russia had a stake, where Russia had some say in the creation of this architecture. We can argue about NATO enlargement or what else could have been done, but I think there would have been there were more opportunities that were missed in the 1990s to create such a system, and of course we see the results of this now. My next point is that from the U.S. point of view, there's been remarkable continuity in policy towards Russia between Democrats and Republicans. I don't have time to go into that now. And that's simply because the inbox that U.S. presidents and Russian presidents have to deal with have remained the same for the past 22 years. And it's really 6 sets of issues. The first one is, and the overriding one still is, the fact that we're the world's 2 nuclear superpowers, and we bear a great responsibility in that regard, and we have to work together on those issues. The second that's related to those issues is the question of nuclear non-proliferation. We again bear inordinate responsibility for the prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and there I go into in great detail the Iran issue, where we've had tensions, but we've also been able to cooperate, North Korea and other similar issues. The third persistent issue, and again, I won't say any more about it, is the post-Soviet space, the definition of Russian interest there, the definition of U.S. interest there, and the inability completely, I would say, to agree on legitimate interests or really ever have a dialogue about it, although it was tried a couple of times, but it never worked. Related to that, then, the question of Euro-Atlantic security architecture and the various proposals that were put forward, including things like then President Medvedev's proposal and what happened to those. The fifth set of issues, which has been very controversial and has really burdened the relationship, is the issue of the domestic situation inside Russia. The United States, as we've already heard today, still tends to believe that one of the responsibilities of its foreign policy is to promote democracy around the world. We can argue about whether that's consistent or not, and we certainly can. That, of course, has caused tremendous problems with Russia, and we've seen increasingly clearly under President Putin a desire to minimize or neutralize the United States' ability to have an impact on what happens domestically in Russia. And obviously this is an asymmetric question too. Russia has not tried to do similar things in the United States. And then the sixth issue, which is a newer issue, is how the US and Russia have dealt with the Arab uprisings. We know that there have been clearly major tensions over what happened in Libya and what happened in Syria, but of course there has been some cooperation too, for instance with the Syrian chemical weapons. So this has been an ongoing issue. Very briefly, do I have 5 more minutes? 3 more minutes. All right. So very briefly, there were 4 resets. George H.W. Bush and President Clinton, those were initiated by the United States. But the third reset was initiated by President Putin. It was his move, his initiative to offer his help after the attacks on 9/11 to the United States, greatly helped the United States in the fall of 2001 in its campaign in Afghanistan and in the then routing of the Taliban. I think the problem there was, again, that Russian and American expectations of what this partnership might bring were very different, but I do think we have missed an opportunity, and that was already talked about today, to have cooperated more with Russia on some of these issues that deal with counterterrorism, where we do, in fact, have similar interests. So if I just come to the final point now, and maybe the least optimistic one at the moment, the Obama reset worked very well with President Medvedev. It obviously became problematic when President Putin came back into the Kremlin. With the granting of asylum to Edward Snowden, that was a major irritant for the White House. So even before the events in Ukraine, the relationship was on a downward slide. We're now in a situation where, frankly, the official US and the official Russian version of the facts in Ukraine are completely different. We can barely agree on any version of the facts. And so we are in, as people have said, probably the worst stage of our relationship since before Gorbachev came to power. Is there a way out of that? It's very hard to see at the current moment how we get from where we are to at least reestablishing some high-level contacts and how we deal with the current situation in eastern Ukraine and how far the West is willing to accept the de facto existence of a frozen conflict there. So at the moment it's very difficult. If somehow we're able to move beyond that, then I think the first question, or one of the first questions that the US and Russia would have to take up in conjunction with all of their allies and states that aren't allied in the Euro-Atlantic space, is to revisit the question of Euro-Atlantic security architecture. Even as I understand the world, as we know, is fragmenting, Russia is looking east and everything, but still, if we cannot get to grips with that fundamental problem, then I think it will be very hard to reestablish any kind of partnership. My advice at the end of the book is that really US presidents shouldn't look for any more resets. They should think of a different way of understanding and dealing with Russia. But I have no doubt that the next US president will probably come into office and try and engineer another reset. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, and congratulations with your book. On wonderful start. Thank you, Angela. Last year, we presented this book to you, which is 22 Ideas to Fix the World, which we edited with a friend of mine, Richard Sakwa. And this book is now translated into Russian and in Chinese. So the Chinese edition will be coming in 2 months from now. But today I would like to introduce another book which we also co-edited with Richard Sakwa. This is the result of a year and a half of work. And this book is, the title is Eurasian Integration, The View from Within. And there are a couple of interesting points about this book, at least from my perspective. First, we invited, usually how you do the collective work. You are calling your friends and colleagues, they are like-minded. It's very similar to working in the social web, because you have these friends that you are linked to on chat or on the Facebook. And the similar thing you do in the collective book. You call your friends and colleagues, they are like-minded, you would like to pursue certain line, and you are creating a conference or a seminar, inviting people, have a book, editing this book, and printing the book. This is the usual process, which is quite time-consuming and difficult, but quite successful. This book was done in a different way. We are presenting in this book. There are 15 authors and co-editors. Actually, some of them, they are here. Sergei Guaziev, Fyodor Lukyanov, Feng Shaolei, Buat Suftanov, and Pavel Andreev from the Valdai Club. What is the differentia specifica of this book, to use the Latin term? The first is that this is the book in which we, as editors, do not agree on many things that the authors wrote. We have a different political stand. We have a different perception of what is right, what is wrong. But we invited not like-minded people, but we were trying to present the whole spectrum of opinion about Eurasian integration. That's first. Second, this book is called Eurasia, the View from Within. This is the second specific things about this book, because they are people from the region. They are not Westerners, except of us. I hardly count as a Westerner, yes, half. So yes, but they are 4 Russians or 5 Russians. Sorry, 3 Chinese, 3 Kazakhs. 4 Ukrainians, 1 Belarusian, and 1 from European Union. And the whole idea was to present this very dynamic, multicultural, multinational perspective on Eurasian integration, with all cultural flavor coming from those chapters. And the rest, probably, because I can talk about this for forever, I got my 7 minutes, so 7 minutes belongs to Richard. And I would like to thank Valdai Club. And the third differencia specifica. This book is owned by the Valdai Club. The copyrights are by Valdai Club. Valdai Club sponsored translation and partly edition of this book. So this is the first book that really does belong to our discussion club. So thank you, Valdai Club, for all the support, both logistic, financial, and content. Richard.
Leonid Grigoriev this morning talked about rounding up the usual suspects. When we were doing this book, we didn't have the usual suspects. We went beyond, and we rounded up a lot of people from within the region and beyond, because what's a fourth specific item about this is that our discussion of Eurasian integration is firmly embedded, if you like, in a classic Matryoshka doll element, not just of post-Soviet space, but also the greater Asia. We had a meeting to discuss the book in Shanghai. Thank you very much to our Chinese colleagues, in particular Professor Feng Xiaolei, which we had an enormously productive meeting there. I was in Shanghai for 3 days, and obviously I'm now a world-class expert on Chinese matters. If I'd spoken to a taxi driver, of course, I'd be even better. So there's a lot of specific issues about this. On the 1st of January this coming year, 2015, of course, the Eurasian Economic Union formally comes into existence. This is a huge development, which I'm astonished that today we've managed to pass the whole day without mentioning it. I'm sure it will be mentioned in due course, because this is, in certain respects, quite a significant milestone. It's a milestone in all sorts of respects. One of them is that it's a symbol and a clear sign that the visions which were dominant in what we would call the classic post-Cold War years, which have lasted for 25 years, which are now over, the idea of establishing some sort of dynamic of what I call the greater European dynamic. In other words, somehow or other touching base with Gorbachev's common European home, Nicolas Sarkozy's idea of a greater European unity, which includes Turkey, of course. In other words, the vision of a multipolar European continentalism, that you'd have Turkey, you'd have European Union, you would actually have many political, and Russia, of course, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on, living and defining themselves in reacting to the specific circumstances of the post-Cold War relationship. Unfortunately, what has happened in the last 25 years, we've had the extension consolidation of a different vision, that what I would call the wider European vision, i.e. based very much on a Brusselocentric vision of what would happen on the European continent. It's a Brusselocentric, this vision of wider Europe, of an ever-enlarging arc of prosperity of the European Union. Fine in its own terms, no problem whatsoever with that, but the failure to negotiate the wider European agenda, which is the Eastern Partnership in its latest models, then, of course, encountered the failure to negotiate that within the framework of a greater European security, economic, and political community, even order, visa-free travel, and all the rest, has meant the conflict which we've now see emerging. In response to it, the Eurasian Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, was, of course, the big idea of Putin's third term, and it remains so in many respects. It's only one idea. He's obviously, events have overtaken it. But nevertheless, the vision of establishing a market of 175 million people, with all of the, in many ways, regionalism is the idea of the early 21st century. European Union, Mercosur, there's a whole series of economic unions being established, developing to a greater, lesser extent. Even Asia, which is traditionally averse to it, is beginning to feel that one way or another, negotiating the reduction of trade barriers, the establishment of more and more single market, labour market, and so on, is, in other words, a progressive thing to do. However, in the post-Soviet context, Eurasian Union, Eurasian Economic Union, has begun to develop as precisely not that. In a sense, it's a very peculiar body because it's not only progressive, because in a classic economic integration sense, it's designed to reduce the transaction costs and so on. I mean, what's wrong with that? However, we all know that the Eurasian Union and its idea, we call it Eurasian Union even though it's officially not called that, this idea has encountered a vision, and in some ways understandably, because it's quite unusual to try to re-establish a country or union or parts of it that existed before. So Eurasian integration is a very peculiar exercise. So it's in a sense, it will inevitably bring in board a sort of an attempt to recreate something that existed in the past, and therefore it will be accused, as our dear Hillary Clinton in Dublin called it, an attempt to re-establish a Soviet empire and so on. Of course, it's not that. So, in other words, it's how to demonstrate the Eurasian Union is, in a sense, in a classic sense, progressive. And it's very tough to do so, but because it's, there's a liberal model of it, there's a conservative model, and of course, the very word Eurasia has a lot of baggage, and by definition, Eurasianism is a sense that it's a repudiation of the West European, or the Europeanism of Russia itself. So, there's an enormous amount of contradictions to the philosophical and issues to be worked through. So this book does, as Piotr intimated, does reflect those debates. And I think that we do have a discussion of Eurasianism and to try out the roots of it, but there's the complexity. So it's in these articles. we have these contradictions, and indeed the view from within. I mean, as I said, as Piotr says, maybe he's not entirely within, but he's certainly not without. And I think the same goes for me, is that because in a sense this whole region is, Eurasian Union is embedded within the European Union context, and it shouldn't be forgotten that, Putin himself says the Eurasian Commission is going to be, is modelled on European Commission, and it's WTO compatible, and it's European Union compatible in certain norms and standards. So anyway, the adventure begins on the 1st of January, and I'm sure in years to come there'll be much more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This book is going to be published by Routledge by December. They just printed us 2 copies, especially for this event. So thank you, Routledge. Richard is very productive, and I am amazed by both productivity and quality of his work. And he also wrote one more book. Actually, it's Putin Redux, Power and Contradiction in Contemporary Russia, which was published this year. And I would like Richard to have his own short presentation of this book, Richard.
I will try to be very short. So this is the book, Putin Redux, Power and Contradiction. Power and contradiction, of course, is rather fancy terms, because it's my attempt. This is my 3rd book on Putin, and it's still trying to get to terms and to grips with the Putin phenomenon, the Putin enigma, the Putin, the nature of the system. And I can tell you this is not going to be my last book, I have a feeling, on the subject, because I still don't understand the man. I've read Clifford Gaddy's, Fiona Hill's fantastic book on it. There's plenty of other stuff. There's other new books, Masha Guess and Karim Dawisha, which, demonize, how can I put it, emphasize the darker sides of the system. So the debate goes on. In fact, my first chapter is precisely, which reviews, the Putin the good and Putin the bad, as it were. But my point is that neither is adequate. That both are simplistic, and it's precisely the contradictory nature of the Putin system, which I think makes it such a dynamic, vibrant, and indeed controversial political phenomenon, because Putinism isn't something, now 15 years, nearly 15 years since the Prime Ministership, August 1999, and of course a leading figure before that. So we have a man who's dominated Russia for well over a decade and a half. And it's, as we heard, the enormous gains. You could say it's simply windfall energy against energy. He's been very lucky. Well, to a degree, as Arnold Palmer used to say when he was playing golf, he says, Arnold Palmer, the funny thing is, the more I practice, the more lucky I become. And so, in a sense, luck is something, like Machiavelli would say, fortuna is in a sense, comes from in a sense, the nature of the person or the beast. So, the contradiction, and I endlessly try to unpack them and to establish, and in some ways, the nature of these contradictions generates this energy and dynamism. What sort of contradictions are we talking about? We're talking about, on the one side, a liberal market economy, Kudrin, of course, 11 years, very, very conventional macroeconomic policies and so on. On the other side, we all know elements of state corporatism, dirigism. It's nothing, you could say it's nothing unusual. The French did it in the post-war years, the state industries and state planning even, because the French had planning. South Korea had planning. So there's nothing absolutely unusual in that model. The other side is, of course, genuinely, I've endlessly been arguing Russia is a dual state. On the one side, a constitutional order, and with all of the elements which go along with it, which is elections and the formal elements, and these are not nugatory, not meaningless. They carry very, very powerful, specific political weight. So, whereas the critics would say, it's only for show, for sham, and so on. I don't think so. On the other side, we do have the dualism, means that there is also, of course, a system, a regime, which stands above and beyond, outside of the system. It's not completely independent, autonomous of the constitutional order, yet, and of course, within all of this, Putin manages brilliantly, constantly, his genius of his statecraft is precisely to draw energy from these two types of systems, two regimes at the same time. And of course, at the international level, as we've just heard, a very, very powerful dynamism to integrate into the national system. We know international system. We know that Putin was negotiating with NATO informally in the early 2000s to join NATO, and that Yapta Hufer, whatever his name is, I decided life was too short to learn his name, and I didn't like him anyway. So anyway, Schäfer was very, very informally discussions were continuing until the word came from our friends across the ocean to say no way. In other words, that the European security order there'd only going to be one boss in it and not two. And Russia, in other words, Russia was excluded from the European security order. So, but which has generated Putin's what I call neo-revisionism. He's not revisionist. He's not trying to repudiate, break the international system. But at the same time, they want to have a word, a way, an ability to shape the norms and their implementation of international law and so on. So that's there's also his personal contradictions of the system. There's also the contradictions of the country itself, which is very complicated. You could argue it's in the middle income trap. It's got all sorts of elements. But the thing about it is, well, it's got the nation itself. Last year we were discussing Russian national identity. I don't know what identity means, but clearly it does mean that a nation's idea of itself. But of course, in Russia, you've got so many different ideas of the nation that, for example, you've got what I argue contesting epistemes, contesting national political liberalism exists. Constitutionalism, the values of it are very deeply embedded. At the same time, a whole stack of neo-traditionalist approaches, neo-Soviet, Eurasianist, neo-Eurasianism, and of course this pragmatic centrism which Putin put forward more and more conservative now. So, bottom line, final comment, is the question which many people in the West certainly argue. Does this system have an evolutionary potential? I mean, where's it going to go? Does it have a potential to evolve? Now, and some people say, we know, many people say, it'll collapse in tears. Well, Enoch Powell, you may remember there's a British politician, Enoch Powell, who said, all political careers end in failure. And people have been anticipating next year the failure of Putin and Putinism. Well, it's an amazing act. It's continued for 15 years. It doesn't have to end in failure. If it can evolve, use its dynamism, use those contradictions, not as a negative, but as a positive. In other words, that strengthen the constitution of the state, strengthen gradually. There is in other words, this is a system with the potential for evolving, just like late Soviet years, you may say. It was evolving under Gorbachev into something else, certainly Archie Brown argues that. So those are the sort of issues discussed in the book. So I was going to say, in all good bookshops, and some bad ones as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, and it's a pleasure to introduce Mikhail Delyagin, Dr. Mikhail Delyagin, who will present his book published this year, Время побеждать, беседы о главном. It's time to win. That will be the translation. And usually, I'm not sure whether the title is the description of the book or whether this description of Mikhail's character. Because Mikhail is known from winning many battles. Very strong personality and a strong mind. So I would expect I will read this book with pleasure, Mikhail, if you will present us one. So Mikhail Delyagin and his book «Время побеждать».
Спасибо большое, дорогие коллеги.
Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues. Well, we had presenters who were very interesting. I also read books, not only those that I wrote myself. Let me share my ideas about Putin. It's not my observation, it's a very vivid observation. Against the background of American and European politicians with whom he communicates, American and European politicians produce the impression of people who are managers tired of meaningless work, who are just sitting at their desk, and Putin is enjoying every moment of life. He is really having hype from what he is doing. when he's discussing the gas prices or world order, and when he negotiated something, he is enjoying every moment. And this love of life, which was absent at the beginning of his political career, differentiates him from the rest of them. Then we all need to learn from China, because many people of different opinions and views and beliefs say this phrase: "I've just visited China on a business trip for 3 days," and for them it's like visiting, doing Hajj for Muslims. So if someone visited China on business, it was important, and there's a lot going on there. When I admire your perseverance and the perseverance of our interpreters who have to work at this time, because you have to understand there are a lot of bars and swimming pools and gyms and nature around us, and we are sitting here. And I'm saying this for myself. I hope that you will leave early. I will have 10 minutes more for myself. This is my book, and as everything that's written before May the 2nd, before what happened in Odessa, it's outdated. It's written in the old reality. It's pre-war. It's a pre-war book, but it kind of predicts today's spirit. The Cold War against us has not started yet when we sent this book to print, but there were different wars to rewrite our history, to turn us into someone who doesn't remember its own history. There was this war for economic demolition of Russia. When we say that they are destroying healthcare in Russia, even in Moscow, they are closing down hospitals and daycare centers. When they are destroying education, and the graduates of university are not aware of the school history program. When we speak about artificial budget crisis in the regions that are suffocating without money, and children are dying with the diagnosis lack of budget money, even though they froze 8.3 trillion rubles in the federal budget. All this had already happened by the time the book was written, but now this process is turning into a new reality, and many are asking, what for? Why has the West turned us into enemies? Why have they declared war to us? Why do they want to destroy us officially? And they introduce sanctions, explaining that these sanctions should destroy Russia. Why? Without losing their respectability, these respectable Western politicians are discussing the destruction of a sovereign Russian political system. Yes, perhaps Putin can be removed, but it's our business. It's not the business for gentlemen from other fashionable countries. People do not understand why a Nazi coup d'etat was organized, staged in Ukraine. So obviously 3 foreign ministers, and none of them even tried to apologize for what happened. The 3 foreign ministers who set up that coup d'etat, no one is appalled at the organization of genocide in Donbass, and we heard about the murder of 2,500 people in the Gaza sector, but the killing of thousands and thousands in Ukraine, it's democracy, it's okay. The answer is quite simple. The Russian Federation is 2% of the population of the earth, owning about 20% of all the resources, and there is crisis in the world. The crisis is getting more severe. There is not enough resources, and what was acceptable in the past is not acceptable anymore. They need to take these resources, and the Nazis in Ukraine was a situational choice of the West. If stamp lovers would be the force in Ukraine, then they would use the government of stamp lovers. So the only Russophobic force in Ukraine was the Nazis, but that's why they were put into their government. But there is this fundamental base, liberalism of today, not liberalism of Voltaire or Sakharov, who defended the freedom of a person, but liberalism of today, which we see since the end of the 80s, and which is based on the fact that if we formulate this consensus into one, that the government, the state, should serve the global business, and if the interests of the global business are against the interests of the people, then the people is bad. And we were already asked questions today that the democracy that serves the interests of the people is bad, and the people are always wrong. And there's another joke that a wrong country was called Honduras, and we hear this from state person. Today's liberalism is the reincarnation of Nazism, of Hitler's fascism in the new conditions. What were the tasks of fascism at the end of 20s and 30s? To establish the big national business was killing small business, turning it to poverty, and they had to do it in such a way so that the small, medium-sized businessmen would lose everything and turn into the working class, and they would have to accept their fate and be proud of it. They were told that they were the best because they belonged to the chosen race, and they said you had the right to rob all others, and then everything would be okay. And it worked. The fascist Germany, their economic model was based on robbing other territories, and they set up hunger, and it was doomed because Nazism is economically non-viable. And now the global business is killing the middle class. The middle class of the rest of the world are the people who consume too much but produce too little in the world of IT. And we need to keep it happy, but bring it down to a lower level. They are told, yes, you have problems, but you are free, and there are slaves around you. You can do with slaves whatever you want. You can burn them, you can kill them, and by and large, you need to rob them. That's why today's liberalism is again the reincarnation of that same Nazism.
And this book, against the background of the previous 23 minutes, I'm probably short of time, but actually, this book is also about the pre-Nazi phase of the Russian liberalism development. I focus on what should be done after we are cured of this grave but not lethal disease. And the last thing which I would like to tell you, those who do think that the front line is now somewhere between the village of Pisky and the airport of Donetsk are kind naive, because actually the front line is between different entrances at the Staraya Ploshchad, and if you compare the presentation made by Mr. Volodin and the presentation to be made by Mr. Shuvalov, you will see that. Thank you.
It was very powerful presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Dilyagin, and our last speaker today, known to everyone, блестящий Kolya Zlobin. And his book, which is «Русский вираж. Куда идет Россия?»
Turn on the mic, Nicholas. Just 5 minutes ago, I thought that probably out of the books to be presented, this one would be the most dramatic, filled with drama. But now I see that compared to what Mr. Dilyagin said, actually I may relax in that respect. Actually, this one is obsolete, is outdated a little bit. 2 or 3 years ago, me and Mr. Solovyevich, a well-known reporter, we wrote a book, Putin and Medvedev, What's Next? It was actually time when this couple emerged and no one really realized what was going to happen next. Now, this book is followed by my new book, The Russian Sharp Turn or U-Turn. So this is the answer to the question, what's next? We try to give an answer to the questions which we posed in our previous book, and I will tell you outright that this book, generally speaking, has to also be followed. There would be a sequel to it, and it was printed in May, and now we have to specify certain details, certain things after those dramatic events in Ukraine. And probably, as you understand, me and Vladimir Solovyov, with all our friendship, we try to calculate something, but in 90% cases we differ in our opinions. But this would be our third book, which we wrote mutually, jointly. And actually, this book incorporates all the events which are filled with drama and which would deserve the talent of Mr. Delyagin. Our editors are crazy about what we write, but really, our book is quite dynamic, and we managed to reach kind of compromise, and we presented there two different viewpoints. What we try to explain by this book, we try to have a look at what is going on in Russia from historical perspective, from more global positions. For instance, we tried to understand in one of the chapters in the book that is dedicated to the notion of a tandem. Actual tandem is not the first one which is personified by Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev, but actually all the tandems ended up with the same thing. And actually in our previous book we wrote that this tandem of Putin and Medvedev will end up with what happened to the previous tandems. Tandems are absolutely atypical to Russia. It was absolutely a failed decision. And you probably remember the history of previous tandems. So, okay, let me comment on your comments about liberalism and Nazism. We make such a conclusion. Probably Richard wrote 3 books about Putin, and he continues to write about Putin. And there's a chapter in our book which is called "We Know Who You Are, Mr. Putin," because our viewpoint is as follows. Putin phenomena is a traditional Russian phenomena. Russia is a country of leaders, of rulers, whatever situation, political situation is, whatever regime is, a democracy or capitalism or a monarchy, whatever the props. Russia would be supported by rulers. This is a country which is built like that, and the problem of this country and the problem of the evolution of Mr. Putin is in the quality of ruling, is the quality of guidance. The level of the totalitarianism in this country would depend on the ruler. For instance, if the ruler or the leader oscillates in favor of democracy, then the whole country would tend to go in the direction of democracy. If the ruler tends to be more a dictator, then immediately the civil society would be curbed, and the leader may just move slowly. This phenomenon has always been observed in Russia. This is a phenomenon which may explain the evolution of Mr. Putin and the cyclical nature of this evolution. And we come to the following conclusion, which was quite sudden for us. Yes, certainly, Russia is a country of democratic institutions. We have the Council of Federation, we have State Duma and Civic Chamber, and if you ask a question in a kind of a poll to the common Russians whether you need freedom of press or you need deputies, the answer would be negative. All those instruments are needed only to the extent the leader would need that, and only when he needs them. and, for instance, a kind of a political symmetry. And then the Council of Federation was required in order to legitimize the accession of Crimea. And immediately after that, we no longer hear about the Council of Federation. So, and for instance, if a law has to be adopted in favor of Mr. Putin, then State Duma would be called on. After that, we hear nothing about that. And so it would turn out that all those instruments of democratic institutions would be required only to the extent the ruler needs that. And Putin phenomenon in that respect is very interesting because the ruler, the leader, is not responsible for anything, either in compliance with the constitution or by the law. This is up to him whether to come to State Duma or not, and this is a kind of reigning. A leader is not responsible for anything, and he uses the mechanisms of the political structure only to the extent he needs that. And Russia loves such unlimited power. It hands to the leader unlimited power, and then we make such a conclusion which is quite arbitrary, and we may discuss it. The conclusion which is related to the following. So Russia always negates the system of power as a system, for instance, as a system of checks and balances of different positions, only if it is needed by the ruler, needed by the leader, then it may be allowed to exist. Whereas, for instance, in the West, such institutions would have some systemic nature. That's why we will never understand each other. For instance, in the West, the systemic system, so to say, was created just in order to avoid having any dictators or leaders. And Ukraine is a very flat country if we have a look at the history of Ukraine. This is a country with no national leaders at all. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was just invented by the Russian historians in order to justify some processes. And Bandera was just, again, one of the inventions. So this is the anti-systemic country. This is an anti-leader country. This is a country with small villages, with individuals. This is a flat country. And now the West requires some democratic reforms. Governance in Russia says, give us a leader to talk to negotiate some issues. This is the contradiction which we stumble upon. And that's why we do not understand the root causes of the crisis in Ukraine. At least one of the answers why we cannot agree on Ukraine, and probably again this would be an arbitrary answer, and it will have a lot of opponents, is about the following. The question which we ask in one of our chapters is why this system reproduces itself all the time in Russia. This is a question which would require an answer. Why in Russia the system would never change, whatever the dressings or the background may be, whatever the props might be? Why the Russian people would always obey to the leader, and a lot of Russian historians would write about that, especially Kluchevsky. Now everything has changed, and we see neither capitalism nor monarchy. Formally, Russia is a democratic nature, but again, it tends in favor of the same country led by a leader or a ruler. And once a ruler tries to change something, just like Gorbachev did, like Yeltsin did, like Putin is doing, the system would actually negate him. The Russian democratic history is actually about leaders who start reforms, and those actually reforms would be broken somehow. Peter I, again, would be a hero who was negated, who was denied the role in the history. So Russia is the country of the heroes who were denied their role. And I think that Mr. Putin would face the same fate. And probably Mr. Putin instinctively feels that, and therefore he tries not to replicate this tradition, and that's why he's very cautious when commenting on his predecessors. He's very cautious commenting on Mr. Yeltsin. And again, this book, which we wrote together with Mr. Solovyev, would require discussion rather than just a presentation. And certainly I will not probably give you exact answers. Thank you.
If you have time, obviously, we have about 20 minutes for debate. Any questions, comments? I saw two, Dr. Hazin and Andrei Klepacz and Sergei Brilov. Tak? Three пока.
Right now we have 3 volunteers. What's your name? Dmitry. I have the following question. It's been said that the leader is hesitating. And did you try to understand whether his hesitation is due to some objective or subjective reasons? I think that those hesitations and fluctuations are due to some objective reasons. And we do not have to analyze him individually, but rather some external factors. I have such a feeling that what happened was caused by some objective factor. But again, I'm interested in your viewpoint because I have a very narrow viewpoint as an economist. It's not a question, rather a comment, probably one brief question. Tomorrow we'll have an opportunity to speak about Ukraine, but this would be rather a message to Michael, who I respect a lot. It doesn't make sense to actually match the nationalist groups which came to power in Ukraine and part of the elites and the liberal ideas, so these things which are not equal at all. There are certain fascist elements in Ukraine, but I don't think that they have nothing to do with liberalism. Otherwise, in your book, it seems that actually fascism is in the full swing in Ukraine, and considering those who are fighting there in Donbass. But I'm not speaking about the fascist groups which are present everywhere and which play a much bigger role in Ukraine than anywhere else. But just focusing only on them, that would be turning everything upside down, because Russian liberalism in your book is associated with fascism too. And back to Putin's phenomenon. I think the answer is simple. Usually, in Russia, power would be one of the attributes of Tsar, and the Secretary General would also be a personification of a Tsar. And as is known, a Tsar is usually dependent on those who surround him, on his subordinates, on his cronies, and he has to be supported by them. And even considering the statements by Mr. Putin, he once said that he regards himself as a manager. In years 2000, he no longer can consider himself to be a manager, but he's not a czar. He feels the sentiments in the society, and he expresses those sentiments much better than any party leaders may do that, or any group leaders might do that. So I think that the political system is much more multifaceted and more sophisticated. And certainly Russia is not the country of rulers. And actually, this is a situation which is more typical for Latin America, where any general would consider himself to be a ruler.
Thank you very much, Sergei Brilov. And then young Chernogursky. I just wanted to give a comment on what Andrei just said, because I think that we just began to discuss terminology, Nazism and fascism. Well, I would like to say one thing that may sound too strong, at least for me, because that depends on how things are presented. We should not put a big cross on Ukrainian liberalism, because the right sector on Maidan was vanguard of the liberal forces. That was something that was not acceptable for me. As for what Nikolai said, well, you know, Nikolai, I didn't publish any new book this year, but I made a film on the 20 years of the Constitution, and I said that on the 12th of December 1993, I voted against that because it was, I believe that it was too presidential with no checks and balances in place. But then I discovered much more material. We went to prisons for females and some other places that were not that were quite peculiar. So I realized later that our reality is very constitutional. So the constitution that was passed at that times during times of Yeltsin. So sooner or later, constitutional process in Russia will bring us to the same situation that we have now, strong figure, etc. But there's several reservations. But for the concentration of forces, but for the systems that we have, then during the direct parliamentary elections, we would have never had that many representatives of liberalism in the parliament. Historically, surprising as that may be, in the authoritarian rule formally gives us quite an opposite result. Angela.
Marxists. I certainly felt it, because the classic English translation of the "что делать" is what's to be done, whilst you said what's to do. You actually sounded a Russian rather than an educated Marxist from the English-speaking part of the world. Now, the question I had for you, strangely enough, not just in this last half year, this last 5-6 years, some of the Western institutions, despite the capitalist character of the economy there, tend to act in a very Soviet way, where politics are somewhat above the economy. Some of the events of this last 6 months certainly reflect this tendency, in my humble opinion. But even if we put this apart, do you think that we shouldn't expect any changes in U.S. policy towards this country before the change of administration? Or there is a slight chance, at least a slight chance, that how many months left before the turnover? 36. Yeah, well, year and a half roughly. Well, you should calculate better than we do. Or we could expect sort of, rethinking of certain things. I didn't quite realize until today, actually, that Secretary Kerry went to see Mr. Lavrov, despite a briefing in Washington just a week ago, which said that we're not going to talk to Russians about ISIS, and yet you have this Paris encounter. So what do you say about it? Here's my question. Before that, I only had humble reflections. Thank you so much.
Теперь я. Да. Николай, благодаря тому, что Россия является лидерской страной, она стала самой великой в мире с самыми великими ресурсами. И это легитимный выбор, легитимный исторический выбор, который Россия сделала когда-то в прошлом. И что это легитимный выбор, показывается лучше всего на сравнении с Польшей. Потому что когда-то Польша была даже более великой страной, чем Московская Русь. Но Московская Русь была лидерской страной, и Польша была страной не позволом. И так случилось...
Не рани души.
Да. И так случилось, что Московская Русь пошла вверх и Польша наоборот. Ну, и теперь, ну, прежде всего США хотят сказать, что это нелегитимный выбор. Ну, покажется, книга Михаила Делягина покажет, является ли это все же, всегда же легитимный выбор или нет. Я думаю, что большинство Валдайского клуба считает это легитимным выбором.
Спасибо, Ян. Дмитрий.
Большое спасибо. Вопрос Николаю Злобину и Анжеле Стенд. Николай, вот в продолжении вопроса Андрея Клепыча, вы сказали, что в России исторически существовала система, когда система для вождя, а не вождь для системы. Но мне тоже кажется, что это некоторое упрощение. На самом деле имели периоды и того, и другого. Да? Если вот вы говорите, что всегда система, когда система для вождя, то как вы объясните после сталинский период в Советском Союзе? Да? Как вы объясните второй президентский срок Ельцина? Ну и так далее. Список можно продолжать. Может быть, вы имеете в виду другое, что когда вот происходит эта трансформация, что вождь становится для системы, Россию неизбежно постигает крах. Да, и здесь можно приводить исторические примеры, там, я не знаю, солдатские императоры в Римской империи, да, вот когда это уже означало вырождение системы принципата и в конечном итоге трансформировалось в доминат, и потом империя рухнула. Now a question to Angela. First of all, let me congratulate you with a brilliant book. I mean, I bought it on the very first days after it was issued electronically because of the long shipment to Russia, and I think this is the first comprehensive book on US-Russian relations, actually, that we have, because the previous books, like by Jim Goldgeiger and Michael McFaul, was on the US policy towards Russia, and you described the relations as the object of your study. The question, a very technical one. When Edward Carr finished his classic 20 years crisis, he was asked the question, the Second World War started actually, and he was asked the question, are you going to somehow rewrite your book and edit it and, and add the part on the war in your study of the 20 years crisis? And his answer was negative. So what about you? Are you going to maybe rewrite this book and add a chapter on the new confrontation? Because you finish with the pretext, with the situation of, let's say, summer 2013, the Syrian crisis and so on. So you finish before Ukraine and before the vibrant transformation of the U.S.-Russia relations. So do you want to continue working on this? And it would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. We have very interesting, not questions, but also comments that I would like you to respond to. And each of you, please, just 5 minutes, because that's what we have, okay? Literally 5 minutes, and they always stop you at any point after 5 minutes will reach the point. And we'll start from Angela.
Thank you. I think I'll just address the questions that I was asked. The short answer to your question is I have a paperback version of the book coming out in English in March, but I have a Russian version of the book coming out sooner, and I have written an updating chapter. So my chapter deals with the Syrian issue, the chemical weapons, and then the ongoing question of the support for Assad. It deals with the Sochi Olympics briefly, but I think that was another point, obviously, of irritation between Russia and the West. And then, of course, in the end, they turned out really quite well for Russia, but obviously in the lead-up, and if you read the Western press and then all of these controversies about, let's say, social issues, that was a problem. And then it focuses also on Ukraine. In fact, my take on this, I won't do the whole chapter, is, one of the problems was the U.S. basically after 2010, when Mr. Yanukovych came back to power and made it clear that he wasn't very interested in a closer relationship with the West, the U.S. said, fine, the Obama administration, we're focusing on the reset with Russia. Ukraine is always an irritant. We pull back, and the U.S. did pull back and let the Europeans deal with Ukraine. And I won't rehearse that. I know we're going to talk about Ukraine tomorrow night, and one can certainly question the way that the EU handled all of this. Then the issue was, of course, once the people were out on the streets, and you then suddenly get a U.S. official going there, and the U.S. takes sides, that obviously complicated the relationship. There's much less to the idea that the U.S. was instrumental in orchestrating all of this than I know most people in Russia believe. Anyway, I do go into that. And the challenge for me in writing that chapter is, how do you end it? I think this Ukrainian crisis will, in fact, the stalemate there will go on for some time. There's not going to be an easy resolution. If indeed it is a frozen conflict, then everyone has to readjust. The problem with sanctions, and we heard a good discussion of this, is at what point do you lift sanctions? And that'll in a moment my answer to the other question. But how do you lift sanctions? When do you lift sanctions? So yes, I did write an updating chapter. Now, of course, one could keep updating it. My next book project is going to be a somewhat broader one, and it really deals with the issues that we've been discussing today, which is how Russia now, Putin's Russia, interacts globally, why obviously there are other major actors in the world, and we've heard some of them that view Russia very differently than the US-European nexus, and what that means going forward for kind of Russia's place in the world. Anyway, so the US-Russian dimension won't disappear from it, but it'll be a smaller part of it because this is a global look. There have indeed been contacts some high-level contacts between the U.S. and Russia. Secretary Kerry and Minister Lavrov, they met last week. Clearly, the ISIS issue is one where, even though I know Russia's criticized the current, U.S. Bombing campaign, we do in fact have rather similar interests. In that, neither country wants to see the Islamic State prevail in this very volatile part of the world. And by the way, we both have groups of people from our respective countries who are fighting there, and then the potential danger of what happens when these people come back either to Russia or to the United States. Yeah. Okay. So there have been some high-level contacts there. One of the issues that has really affected the U.S. response to all of this has been the fact that we have elections coming up on November the 4th. The question is, will the Senate no longer be controlled by Democrats, by Republicans? And therefore, President Obama's response to the Ukraine crisis has become very much a domestic political issue. Mm-hmm. You see this even now, and part of the broader question of, is he a weak leader, and is his foreign policy dysfunctional? So it's become partly a victim, if you like, of domestic politics. Once the elections are over, and I think irrespective of who controls the House, look for, does the Corker-Menendez bill in the Senate get passed? If that bill is passed, then that would really be very detrimental for U.S.-Russian relations, because that would really set them back even further. If it's not passed, I don't see any major change in the rest of the Obama administration in policy toward Russia. But I think certainly Secretary Kerry and Minister Lavrov, I think, will be the two people carrying on whatever there is, particularly on these multilateral issues, but not on bilateral ones.
Thank you very much. Angela, Nikolai, 5 minutes, but literally 5 minutes, please.
Okay.
I do not know. I have not read your new book, Richard, but when analyzed Putin, just to look at his phenomenon in the year 2000, a person with no political program, with no political party, with zero rating came, and he was promoted by a failure president. And what do we have as a result of that? 14 years after that, we have this sort of leader. What does the system do So there's still the question whether a system is for the leader or the leader is for the system. Well, naturally he has certain abilities. He had background, but he was promoted to that position. How he came into the fore? Where did he get his political program and the opposition from oligarchs and the military, the law enforcement bodies? How did he overcome all that? So that's the issues that we raise in our book. Another issue that we raised: who and how evaluates the successfulness of political leadership in Russia? What is a successful leader? Was Medvedev a successful leader or not? That's the question we raised. If he was successful, well, according to all formal factors, he was successful. Why he was not re-elected? So we came to the conclusions that is quite debatable at a certain period of time of presidential presidency. Evaluation of success was in the hands of a small circle of elite. Putin's third term in office is that he radically changed his orientation. He tries to base to find ground in populism and giving up on the support of his elite. He is changing in this respect, whether he is changing under somebody else's some external influence or not. But in Russian situation, any effect that is exerted is good. But it is not possible that a leader is dependent on himself. The country with when the leader in Russia, with the army at his hand and nuclear resources, and when he begins to depend only on his own opinion, that's not good for the country. It is important to have links with. When this is missing, then this is the worst possible variant. When the leader depends only on himself. So, well, I forgot your question, actually. What did you want to... Well, okay, let's not run along the same... I wanted to say something very interesting. Well, I think that you wanted to say that is a much more complex system. Well, you gave only 5 minutes to me to describe. Naturally, the book is more complex. But we stem from a very simple idea that was once pronounced by Putin about 5 years ago at the Valdem Club. He said, I'm not a politician. I'm just managing the country, governing the country. I'm the master of the Russian land. I'm not a politician. I have not to report to anyone. I do not think about the future. I have no political party. I do what I believe necessary for the country. Well, just accept me the way I am. He said that openly. This is not a political work to be leader of the country. That's the essence of that. So we should not evaluate him being guided by political factors. Dr. Dilagin, thank you very much. I think that it's necessary time for me to write a book on Putin. At least I remember, facts of my life rating. Rating grows up to the level of 94.1%, and then civic society dies. This is not something that, this is something that is invited to form the day-to-day life. But if we have if it is something that we can keep at the routine level, then, the Council of Federation is naturally the political symmetry. But what is the Chamber of Lords in Great Britain? No irritation with regards to that. I understand that we all have phobias. I understand very well that in our culture there are some terms that should not be used, such fascism or Nazism. But what I was speaking about Nazism. Russian liberals are not against that. There was not a single demand on investigation of murder of people on the 2nd of May. There were a lot of apologies because of the crash of Malaysian airplane, although everybody was well aware that we were not the cause of that. Khodorkovsky said after the 9 years in prison, and I think that what he said, he was well aware of what he was saying, that in Kiev, in Kiev there are not more of Nazis than in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. We also saw portraits of Bandera on the 9th of May, but nobody objects to terror of special service units and dozens of people disappearing from the earth. And they call it democracy, but this is a true Nazism. Yatsenyuk treats is for Nazism, and it is not the nationalistic units from the Western Ukraine that fought, but some Russians, hired Russians. I can say that with their worldview, I am not scared by their worldview. I'm not scared by their happiness that they're not Russians, but what I'm scared by is their growing, their confidence that people living in Russia, those who do not want to become Ukrainians, and those who do not want to become Ukrainians are not people, are not human beings, and they are meant for destruction. And these are the views that were expressed by parliamentary members in Ukraine, and their cool confidence But that reminds me of Nazi Germany, when Germans said that Jews have no right to exist. In this situation with Ukraine, Russians were appointed Jews. But if the leadership does not follow certain criteria, that can be explained by discrepancies in culture. But till the time that power takes into account the opinion of the people, then we have democracy. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all participants of our discussion, and dear colleagues, I invite you to write books. Write them, and I will discuss them, and we'll present them, and what is more, we will read them. And this is a great honor for us to discuss these books in such a great company. I invite you to write books, and next year we'll discuss them. I just received information that Andrei Kortunov passed to me that in Canadian Parliament they have battles, and IS that Islam IS terrorists took over the Canadian Parliament, and with the rules or without rules, we're all living in a very shaky situation. I'd like to thank the Valdai Club for the possibility to discuss books. Thank you.